Hi, Tzeporah, and everybody else who's on the call. I'd like to welcome you very much to this presentation, our weekly Zoom session for the Canadian Association for the Club of Rome. I feel you're a particularly special guest for us at this point in time, not only because of your past experiences, but because of your current endeavor with the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Committee. For those who don't know, there's a great deal of information about Tzeporah's background on the internet, Wikipedia page and all. She has an honorary doctorate from the University of British Columbia. She's been appointed by various provincial governments, BC and Alberta in particular, as an advisor. She really started in the War of the Woods in Clayoquot Sound about 30 years ago. But her involvement in trying to protect old growth forests certainly hasn't ended. She was at Fairy Creek last year. One thing in particular that I like about what Tzeporah has been saying recently is that a major solar spill is a sunny day. So I very much look forward to hearing your introduction to us of this new proposal to have an international agreement on reducing fossil fuel use. Over to you, Tzeporah.
Thank you so much, Dave, and thank you to all of you for inviting me to join you today. I want to recognize that I'm speaking to you from the unceded territory of the Tsleil-Waututh, the Squamish, and the Musqueam First Nations here in Vancouver, Canada. I'm really excited to talk to you today about the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. And I think it's important whenever we talk about solutions to climate change that we always start looking directly at what we're facing. Is a fascinating thing about climate change that I've noticed over the last 30 years is that many people know what's happening now and are experiencing it in their daily lives. But there's such a disconnect between, for most of us, what we're experiencing in our daily lives and how life goes on and the response from decision makers and the science, that we continue to turn away from it. I think of it a lot like staring into the sun, that we need to start all of these conversations looking right now at what we're facing. I know for this audience, and a lot of you know a lot about climate change, so I'm certainly not going to spend a lot of time today just talking about the science and the impacts. But again, I think it's always critical to start with what we're facing. We know today that climate change is humanity's greatest threat, that more people are now forced to leave their homes as a result of environmental disaster and climate impacts than war. In the past couple of years, we've felt that in the impacts of climate change in our daily lives. And while we've all been faced with the science and the predictions of what would happen in a world faced with a changing climate, it really is happening now. Next week, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change will release the second working group, the second report on climate science and the impacts that we're experiencing. As many of you know, the modeling that we've been looking at for decades is only wrong in that it underestimated the experience that we're having now on the planet. We are experiencing, as a result of extreme weather and climate change, a dramatic increase in refugees over the last couple of years, up to 65 million people a year. We are not dealing with it well as a global community. The most commonly cited estimate of total climate migrants as a result of our changing climate is about 200 million by 2050, according to the International Organization for Migration. And UN representatives last year told the Security Council that water scarcity produced by climate change is driving a cycle of conflict in developing countries. Simultaneously, we know by 2050 that the Food and Agriculture Organization estimates food production will plummet across Asia, Africa, and Europe, and around the world by somewhere between 45 and 50%. And food costs globally are already skyrocketing. This year, UN agencies told us that droughts and flooding had reversed progress on global hunger, driven food shortages and malnutrition to 10-year highs. These are just, of course, some of the impacts that we're already seeing around the world. I have experienced these impacts face to face here in British Columbia last year with the fires, the heat dome that killed hundreds, followed swiftly after that by the floods. This is the moment that we're living in. For the last several decades, I've been trying to understand what we're doing about it as a country, and now what we're doing about it globally. And I want to tell you a little story about my journey into my own climate reckoning and why I decided to focus on fossil fuel supply, and particularly the expansion of oil, gas, and coal. So my journey starts here in Canada's northern forests. This is an image taken by photographer Garth Lenz in the boreal forest in northern Alberta. I started my work as an environmental advocate because of my love of forests and Canada's beautiful wild places. And I spent the first decade working on conservation issues. And as Dave mentioned in my introduction, on trying to stop the industrial logging of what remains of our old growth forests. Sometime around 2004 or 5, a map crossed my desk of the fires that were of the forests that were disappearing because of fires, because of beetle infestations, because of a rapidly changing climate. And I realized that I had spent my entire adult life trying to protect these forests from industrial logging, but now they were under even greater threat because of our changing climate. And it was at that moment that I realized that I needed to better understand climate change and what was happening and what was causing it, that it wasn't good enough for me to say someone else deals with that. I work on this conservation issue. I started trying to figure out what Canada was doing about climate change and how we were doing. And as I'm sure many of you here know, we haven't been doing well on reducing our emissions. So we know this, we know the basics. We're experiencing this incredible change in weather systems, in extreme weather and floods and fires, in large part because of the emissions trapped in our atmosphere. 70% increase in emissions trapped in our atmosphere since 1970 that are blanketing the earth and smothering the planet. Canada's emissions have not gone down significantly in the time that I've worked on climate change. And when I first started working on these issues, trying to understand what was the fastest growing component of Canada's emissions, what was going to be the hardest thing for us to do to reduce emissions, of course, I discovered that Canada was embarking upon a massive expansion of the oil sands. So this is probably about 15 years ago when I really started working on oil sands issues in Alberta. And I was really devastated that so much of our forest was being lost to expand the oil sands, but also to find out that it's one of the dirtiest forms of fossil fuel energy in the world. Although compared to many countries in the world, our global emissions are small, as I'm sure many of you know, our per capita emissions are the highest in the world, in large part because of our oil and gas development. And this chart actually shows our climate change performance. This is in 2013, when I really dug into these issues of oil sands and launched the first campaigns that I started to run on oil sands issues. But in fact, our position hasn't changed that much today. I was horrified to find out that Canada was ranked worse for all G8 countries, and in fact, under all OECD for our climate performance. And at the time, I thought it was because we had a prime minister that didn't really believe in climate change, that had announced that he was going to triple the size of the oil sands, that Canada was going to become an energy superpower, and of course, then embarked on ambitious agenda to increase pipelines across the country. And of course, these plans for pipelines were met with resistance from Washington, D.C. to northern British Columbia to Quebec for Energy East. Our country has been rocked over the last decade by these constant pipeline battles. When the Trudeau government was elected, I and many others watched with tears in my eyes as the Prime Minister stood at Paris at the UN Convention on Climate Change and announced with his hand on his heart that Canada was back and we were going to turn a corner on climate change. And to his credit, the Prime Minister and his team worked very hard to put in place the Pan-Canadian Climate Framework and a national price on carbon, which I think is absolutely critical to addressing climate change. But I'm sure it's not news to most of you that we still rank poorly compared to other G7 countries. In fact, Canada's emissions at best, we could say, have flatlined, are certainly not going down, and our trajectory is, well, to put it frankly, embarrassing on an international scale in terms of addressing the climate crisis. The Pan-Canadian Climate Framework is the eighth climate plan that Canada has had. I think it is probably one of the most, it's the most progressive. It has a lot of incredible and important components in it. However, our emissions from the oil and gas sector continue to rise. And just emissions from production alone are now the fastest growing source of Canada's emissions and the largest component of Canada's emissions. And I'm sure many of you know that's only represents 20% of a barrel. So when a barrel of oil is burned, 80% of the emissions from that barrel of oil or gas come at the point of combustion, which is, considering we export most of our oil and gas, not here in the country, but still just the production emissions are now the largest and fastest growing source of Canada's emissions. This experience in Canada convinced me to look around the world and to try and understand what are the frameworks for constraining the supply side of fossil fuels. The demand side is basically how we've structured climate policy for the last 3 decades, really focusing on carbon pricing, on initiatives to increase the uptake of electric vehicles, energy efficiency, and renewables. But the fact is, climate policy and climate politics are complicated. But what's not complicated is that our emissions, 86% of the carbon dioxide emissions from the past decade that are currently trapped in our atmosphere come from 3 things. They come from 3 products: oil, gas, and coal. And shockingly, we don't really have frameworks, regulatory and policy frameworks for aligning our production of these 3 products with our climate goals, either nationally or internationally. So my work on the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty starts here with the basic understanding that climate change is now one of the greatest, if not the greatest, global security threat. Many of you know the World Economic Forum Global Risks Perception reports that come out every year. For many years, weapons of mass destruction were considered the greatest impact to global security, the most likely impact to global security. In the past couple of years, we now see failure to act on climate, extreme weather, biodiversity loss, the water crisis as the greatest and most likely threats to humanity. So, I mean, the summary, of course, many of you know, the risk of climate disruption. The world is now on track for about a 4-degree temperature change by 2100. The pledges made at Paris by our governments are consistent with heating about 3 degrees by 2100. But the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has noted that if we want to constrain warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, which even at 1.5 degrees Celsius has devastating and irreversible impacts around the world, we need to reduce emissions by 45% by 2030. So that is a huge challenge, considering that right now we continue to grow not only emissions, but the production of fossil fuels and embed future emissions. Climate change today, like nuclear weapons, is an existential threat. Turning to the production side of fossil fuels, a couple of years ago, the United Nations and Stockholm Environment Institute and other partners produced the Production Gap Report. This report is the first time that we've really looked at how much is the world producing, and does it align with our Paris goals? What we find out from the Production Gap Report is that we're currently on track to produce more than double the fossil fuel production than is consistent with 1.5 degrees. So I just want to pause here a moment to reinforce what I've just said. Looked at a different way, we already have more coal, gas, and oil in existing installations that are already producing or under construction to take us well past 1.5 degrees. So there is already enough, either above ground or currently under construction. So any new projects, whether that be the new proposed offshore drilling Bay du Nord off Canada's east coast, or the LNG Canada and expansion of fracking in British Columbia, new oil sands mines, any new single project is producing a product that we know is killing us and that we can't burn, or it will burn us. A lot of people over my journey in the last 10 years to work on fossil fuel supply have said that we just need to focus on the positive. We need to build the solution. We need to focus on building renewables and talking about the solution. And in fact, at one climate conference in Canada, I was told by someone from the Prime Minister's office that I needed to stop talking about oil and gas and fossil fuels because it's rude and it creates polarization. 10 years ago, 80% of the energy that the world uses came from fossil fuels. Today, 80% of the energy that the world uses comes from fossil fuels. The approaches that we have taken in the past to climate policy, to climate politics, to growing renewables and constraining fossil fuels, even while we knew how serious the crisis is, have not been working. I think we've reached a turning point in the last year, though, on this debate and on fossil fuel supply. Last year, the International Energy Agency confirmed what the Production Gap Report for the last couple of years has been saying, that there is no need for investment in new fossil fuel supply under a net zero pathway. The United Nations and the IPCC reports, also for the first time last year, said their reports must sound a death knell for coal and fossil fuels before they destroy the planet. Both reports confirm that if we are going to meet our Paris goals, then we need to stop the expansion of new fossil fuels and fossil fuel infrastructure. The global financial system is underpinned by projects and plans dependent on the current energy system, from the direct extraction projects themselves to the adjacent infrastructure, to the downstream end use facilities. A rapid switch in fuels at the center of our energy system will put pressure on the stability of these dependent countries and our financial systems as a whole. So we need careful planning and international coordination. They're essential to meet the challenges and to rapidly phase out fossil fuels. We need a global just transition. That means that we need to address who gets to produce and what and for how long. But those conversations need to be based on the principles of equity, And no country or company can do this alone. So what are the systems we have in place to do it? The Paris Agreement doesn't even mention the words coal, oil, or gas. I'll never forget the day that I searched the agreement for the words. Even fossil fuels, they don't exist in the world's climate agreement because the fossil fuel industry has been successful in making itself invisible, in avoiding the conversation, the hard conversation about the products that they produce. So while there are some mechanisms in the Paris Agreement for constraining the supply side of fossil fuels, they are very few, and the structure is not there to quickly negotiate an end to expansion. Countries can include constraining supply within their NDCs, their nationally determined plans and contributions. And there are a couple of other mechanisms that we are also exploring. But the need for international cooperation on the phase out of fossil fuel expansion and supply is great. So over the last couple of years, I've been working with academics and diplomats around the world to explore what this would look like. What we know is that given the urgency and scale and the challenge, we need unprecedented international cooperation. And I think this research by the Stockholm Environment Institute underscores why. It really looks at the differences, it demonstrates the challenge. So while there's no doubt that any fossil fuel producing country faces major challenges, if you look at countries like the US, Canada, the UK on the left of the chart, not only do they have much more diversified economies so that they aren't dependent on oil revenues for their taxation or for the provision of government services, but they also have higher GDP per capita, which indicates a greater capacity to transition away from fossil fuels. Yet we know in Canada, it's not going to be easy. It's certainly going to be easier than countries like Azerbaijan, Iraq, Congo, Timor-Leste, or somewhere like Ecuador. I do a lot of work in the Amazon. Ecuador is currently proposing new oil drilling in the heart of the Amazon rainforest in intact areas that is opposed by indigenous nations that live there. When we drill in the Amazon, it's like a double climate impact, of course, because of the biodiversity impact, and the roads for the oil drilling open up new areas of the Amazon to fires. And while the Amazon rainforest is essential to all of us for the global hydrological cycles and maintaining a stable climate, Ecuador is only doing that new oil drilling to feed their debt. In fact, they have a debt for oil swap with China. So if we're saying we need to end the expansion of fossil fuel production now, many countries are going to need support for that, debt forgiveness, economic support in order to leapfrog over the fossil fuel system and address energy poverty through electrification and diversified renewable systems. This chart shows a similar trade-off between the level of the challenge and capacity to transition, but expressed in terms of dependency of a country's workforce on coal mining. So as you can see, Australia is somewhere in the middle in terms of dependence, but right near the top in terms of capacity. So it's these analyses that we're now working on to identify the rates of wind down of fossil fuel production that are going to be possible for each country, and what kind of mechanisms and principles would be necessary under a treaty to negotiate a global just transition out of fossil fuel production. The Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty is structured around 3 pillars, similar to nuclear non-proliferation. First of all, of course, non-proliferation, preventing the proliferation by ending all new exploration and production of oil, gas, and coal. Global disarmament, phasing out existing production in line with a 1.5-degree world. And then, of course, the peaceful transition, fast-tracking real solutions through scaled-up access to renewable energy and just transition for every worker, community, and country. Here, I want to just briefly flag that we're using the language of non-proliferation for 2 reasons. First, because we're trying to develop a framing of fossil fuels as being equivalent to weapons of mass destruction, because they are. Harvard reported last year in a groundbreaking study that 1 in 8 people today. 1 in 8 deaths around the world come as a result of fossil fuel pollution. It's not just because of climate that fossil fuels pose an existential threat. It's also because of the health impacts to individuals and communities as a result of fossil fuel expansion. And second, because the 3 pillars of the NPT of non-proliferation, disarmament, and peaceful transition really map well onto what needs to happen for fossil fuels. We recognize that the non-proliferation treaty itself hasn't been as successful as many hoped. And we're also looking at examples like the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons to build our campaign and our diplomatic strategy, because this is a great example of a regime where a huge coordinated civil society movement and a majority of non-nuclear armed states can have a huge impact by changing the narrative of nuclear weapons and enforcing limits on nuclear armed states. This is, I think, the kind of thing that needs to happen on fossil fuels. And we're already in discussion with what we consider some of the first mover countries that are willing to step up and help create that dialogue. What if we don't do this? What if we don't constrain the expansion of fossil fuels? It makes the transition harder. It creates stranded assets. It risks financial turmoil. It locks us in politically and physically to a fossil fuel future. The decisions we make today on something like a pipeline, take the Trans Mountain pipeline, which has been in the news here in Canada. This is a 20 to 25.
To recognize Donetsk and Luhansk as separate.
This is the Trans Mountain pipeline is a.
Thank you for doing that for your birthday.
That's great. Good idea.
I think someone, maybe it's Gordon coming up on my screen, needs to mute. We can hear you. Great, thank you.
I got them, go ahead.
Thank you. So the lock-in of infrastructure is critical. People talk about a lot, we heard a lot from government industry in Canada that the Trans Mountain pipeline will help us fuel the transition by economic revenue to transition to cleaner energy systems. But the fact is, you don't build a pipeline for a year or 2 or even 10. If you're spending $20 to $25 billion on a pipeline, that pipeline is built to deliver oil for the next 30 to 40 years. If that's necessary, if we use that pipeline for that amount of oil for the next 30 to 40 years, then we're banking on our failure to address climate change. We know we need to use less and less fossil fuels, and we need to manage a wind down, a phase out of fossil fuels. So we can't be building more infrastructure today that will grandfather in that level of fossil fuel consumption and production. Delay also increases the risk of warming. It delays economic diversification. So many incredible reports over the last decade have shown us that every dollar that we spend today, that we don't spend today on the solutions, on renewables, will mean that we have to spend more in the future. We already know that the impacts of climate change today, even in Canada, are costing us billions, and those costs are only going to increase. So who are we and what are we doing? The Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative is a directed network. It's guided by a global steering committee of academics and diplomats and advocates from around the world. We work in collaboration with a diverse range of partners and foundations, over now 1,300 organizations. And I'm going to dig into a little bit about who has supported the concept so far and what we're doing. But roughly, we've organized our work under a cities initiative. Of course, many of you will remember nuclear-free cities signs popping up around the world, and what an important role cities played in calling for nuclear non-proliferation. We believe the same can be true of cities in calling for a fossil fuel treaty. Cities are less politically influenced by the fossil fuel sector, and often first movers when it comes to climate change, because they see the impacts of climate change in their communities. We have a media and communications team and a campaign team that is working with organizations from around the world to design campaigns for a fossil fuel treaty, a research and analysis and academic arm where we're doing the research for the principles and mechanisms that would underlie the treaty. And that can inform the analysis of how to really lump and split the countries in order to create, to understand the barriers to stopping fossil fuel expansion. And then, of course, we have a political advocacy and diplomatic team who is now meeting with nation states around the world. The objective of not only the treaty, but the campaign itself is to change the global norm on fossil fuels. We have all grown up with the idea that fossil fuel expansion means prosperity, that it is essential to our economic health. This is no longer true. In fact, oil and gas and coal are operating at the bottom of the S&P index. There are more bankruptcies in that sector than any other sector. And while we do have a high price today, which is creating yet another boom and arguments for the fossil fuel industry to expand, we know that it will be followed by yet again another bust. And if you track fossil fuel free indexes over the last decade, they're making more money than fossil fuel in pension funds and investments. And that's why we've seen such a dramatic growth in the divestment movement. One of the reasons we've seen such a dramatic growth in the divestment movement, over $40 trillion has divested out of fossil fuels in the last 10 years. We want to provide the missing framework and mechanism for a multilateral agreement for a just transition, to grow the movement of individuals and people calling on their governments for urgent action, to motivate cities and states to not only endorse the treaty, but also to phase out coal, oil, and gas in their own regions. We need to increase the transparency and accountability of who is producing what and how much. Which is why our team has been working with Carbon Tracker International and the Global Energy Monitor to create the first ever global registry of fossil fuel production. It didn't exist before. If anyone wanted to look and see who's producing what fossil fuels and where, you would have to piece it together. It doesn't, countries are not responsible. They're responsible for reporting on their emissions, but not on their production. And we hope that the Global Registry of Fossil Fuel Production, which will go live later this year, will start to change that. And we also want to complement the frontline and finance campaigns with a unifying political demand. Right now, we are faced with these constant new proposals and new campaigns around the world. We want to make them greater than the sum of their parts. While divestment and financial initiatives on climate change are critical, we need to hold governments to account because of the time crunch that we're in to shift and move. So the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty as a whole is the diplomatic engagement, the research team, the executive team, which I run with our director, Alex Rafalowitz, the cities engagement and campaigns and communications team. We've only been public for a year, but we've grown very quickly. I was really excited last night to generate this heat map and realize that when you look at what organizations around the world have now endorsed the treaty and are starting to plan campaigns for the fossil fuel treaty, it shows almost every region of the world. Even 2 months ago, this map was blank in Latin America, or a couple of months ago, and every day new organizations are joining the campaign. So now well over 1,000 civil society organizations, new allies and partners every day. Last week, Amnesty International joined the campaign and is currently hard at work on plans to work with governments and lobby governments on the fossil fuel treaty in many countries. Just this year, we had COICA, the Federation of Indigenous Nations, so chiefs from all 9 Amazonian nations endorse the fossil fuel treaty and start to work on it, as well as Healthcare Without Harm and many other organizations. Youth activists from around the world are now calling for the fossil fuel treaty. We have 2,000 youth activists from 90 countries who launched their campaign for a fossil fuel treaty at COP26. It made the front page of CNN for an entire day, which was pretty exciting. And it's really inspiring to work with all these youth activists. We have climate champions from around the world, well-known people from around the world who work on climate change or security and peace issues. I urge you to go to our website, Fossil Fuel Treaty, and see who the champions are. It's an astounding group of people who are now starting to engage and be motivated. We've had 101 Nobel laureates, including the Dalai Lama, endorse the principles of the Fossil Fuel Treaty. Already 39 cities have passed motions at city councils to endorse the Fossil Fuel Treaty, including just last week, Amsterdam. Paris will announce next week. I'm proud to say the city of Vancouver was the first city to pass a motion to endorse the Fossil Fuel Treaty. Over 3,000 scientists and academics have now endorsed the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative and are calling on others to join them. This is a really important piece of our initiative to communicate to governments and decision makers around the world that while of course it is a pretty bold and audacious to say that we need to stop all new fossil fuel development, all oil and gas projects, and stop the expansion of them and wind them down immediately. It is an initiative and proposal that is supported by science. And then last year, we had parliamentarians from around the world start calling for the end to expansion and the wind down and support the principles of the Fossil Fuel Treaty. This initiative was created by parliamentarians from the Global South, but you'll see on their independent website, fossilfuelfreefuture.org, that there are now, I think it was 180 parliamentarians from 33 countries, including many from Canada. So elected officials who are now calling on their governments to start to negotiate a fossil fuel treaty. So the treaty initiative has grown considerably in the last year. We've just started doing diplomatic engagement in the run-up to Stockholm Plus 50, which is a conference that is in June. We'll be working there to bring the treaty to the attention of many nation states and really forward this conversation about the need to constrain fossil fuel supply. As I mentioned, we're building the evidence base, a research agenda, and really looking at breaking down the concepts of equitable phase out and the barriers to international cooperation, and developing a research stream that will inform nation states when they start to negotiate a treaty. And we've also developed a campaign hub, so campaign tools for any group around the world that wants to campaign on the treaty and to talk to each other. We provide videos there and how-to kits and motions for city councils moving forward. So I encourage you at this critical moment in history to join us. This is an idea whose time has come. Many people say, I've had people say to me since I did my TED Talk on this topic in November, you know, I love the idea, but can we really get a treaty? And isn't it a little ambitious? We only just finished negotiating the Paris Treaty. I know that this is a big, bold idea, but at this moment in history, we need big, bold ideas. What we have been doing in the past has not been working. And right now, with our international agreements and our domestic policy focusing only on constraining the demand of fossil fuels while allowing the production of fossil fuels to grow, we're essentially saying that we will leave it up to the marketplace to decide the fate of humanity, that we'll allow price and other market levers to decide who gets to produce what fossil fuels and how much. We can't afford to let that happen at this moment in history. We need to try new ideas, and we need to try ideas that will inspire us all to act in a way that is commensurate with the scale of the crisis that we're facing. Thank you.
Thank you, Tzeporah. That was amazing. I'm going to start things off with a question, and who I got on deck just a moment. Paul Beckwith, you're on deck. You're actually in the queue twice, so just please keep your first question and we'll get back to you later if we have time. So a month or so ago, I would never have expected an occupation and unrest of the scale that we just saw in Canada. It was certainly unprecedented in my experience. And I think while many of us understand the need for this fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, just as we understood the need to fight the SARS-CoV-2 virus, I wonder how it is that we may be able to avoid the kind of civil unrest that we just saw with people opposing that kind of move. We do need to reform our energy system, but we may well face a real backlash. And I'm wondering whether you've expected this and how you see it being countered.
Thanks. It is a great question. And I think right now what we're seeing is the fossil fuel industry and the alt-right use this moment that we're living in of fear to push forward an agenda that defines security with continued access to fossil fuels. But here are the things in our favor. Clean energy systems are more resilient to extreme weather and political upheaval, for that matter. They provide greater certainty, and they diversify power. So the power for our energy systems are not held in the hands of a few. So what I think is really essential is that we flip our communications around climate change and around what needs to happen, so that we are acknowledging people's fear in this moment in time. What fuels these populist movements is thinking about the past and wanting to go back to the past. And that is representative of this need that people have in this time of great change, of pandemics, of extreme weather, to feel some sense of security. So when I'm talking to, for example, an audience in Alberta, what I really try and do now, and what I've learned to do over the last several years, is to acknowledge people's fear, acknowledge how difficult the change is going to be, because underselling how difficult this transition is going to be is not helpful. It's not easy for people to entirely change their jobs or livelihoods. But what the fossil fuel treaty gives us is a commitment to a plan. What we're asking governments for is a plan to manage the wind down of fossil fuel production and systems, rather than allow that instability, that boom and bust, because if we allow that, then more people will suffer. So I think there's a piece around making sure that our communications are around planning, are around security, and acknowledging people's fears. I also think we have to encourage governments to acknowledge the science and what needs to happen. The disconnect that's happening for a lot of people is they don't think we need to make big changes, because if the science was true, then our governments would be acting more. So the research that we're now seeing in climate communications and climate psychology is part of people react against the carbon tax or climate policy because they don't, if we really needed it, if it really was an emergency, then our decision makers would be acting like it's an emergency. And because they're not, then people don't think we need to make the changes. So we need to be constantly encouraging and demanding of our political leaders that they act like it's an emergency, like they did with the pandemic.
Okay, great, thank you. So Paul Beckwith, and I've got Vic Buxton on deck.
Yes, thank you. So my question is do do you know the per capita, the Canadian per capita subsidy on fossil fuels at the moment, and how that compares to the per capita subsidy on renewable energies? Now, also, our government promised over a decade ago to phase out fossil fuel subsidies, and even the recovery after the pandemic, that money has been plowed mostly into fossil fuel subsidies as opposed to renewables. So do you see any sign that those subsidies will be eliminated in Canada?
I don't know. I don't know it per capita, but I'll throw some documents in the chat. IASD has just done a very careful analysis of Canada's fossil fuel subsidies and reported out what they are. And by province, I think somewhere around 3.3 billion a year for the fossil fuel industry, 3.3 to, I think this last report said 4 billion a year to the oil and gas industry in direct and indirect subsidies. So yes, our government committed to get rid of fossil fuel subsidies. I think there is a lot more rigor now at a provincial and a federal level, at least in British Columbia and federally, in looking at what those fossil fuel subsidies are. Part of the inaction that we've seen is in part because of the power of the fossil fuel lobby. We can now see, as a result of the tremendous work of the Corporate Mapping Project, which is CCPA plus a number of universities across the country for 5 years. They've been looking at the influence from a quantitative and qualitative perspective of the fossil fuel industry in lobbying federal and provincial governments in Canada. So every day there are multiple meetings across this country between the fossil fuel industry, oil and gas companies, and government officials, and that takes a toll. But what's also happened is that they've really tried to make the issues so dense and so complex, and they've argued that what they're getting is not subsidies. So what I love about the ISD reports is they use the WTO definition of fossil fuel subsidies. And I think that that's what we should be using. The industry is, of course, arguing that they don't get any subsidies, which is just absurd. I mean, in British Columbia alone, there's probably $1 billion in literally direct subsidies and things like the deep well credits. So the confusion over the definitions is how the government has hid behind that, and we've seen a lot of inaction. So I think I've seen more movement in the last year with the BC subsidies review and the federal government review of subsidies. So I'm feeling hopeful that these issues are now being addressed. However, we did see we're now seeing a lot of subsidies hidden under the idea of technological innovation around CCUS, carbon capture and storage. So industry is promising to reduce emissions per barrel to become more efficient. And if they do that, then therefore emissions will go down. However, they're using it to justify an increase in production, not a reduction in overall emissions. And they're also using it to convince governments to give them more money. I think that the industry should be pursuing CCUS and any technology that can reduce emissions. But I think companies that are still today having record profits and paying their senior executive literally billions should be paying for their own technologies to reduce emissions, especially when all of the studies that look at the money that could go into CCUS versus that money going into direct renewables, energy efficiency, retrofits, or electrification show that the government can get more greenhouse gas emissions reductions from $1 spent on pure low carbon than it can on what's called gray carbon capture and storage. So I think public money should be going into the solutions that benefit the public as a whole that give us access to better transit, that give us access to retrofit programs, that give us better grid stability and electrification options, and not more money, especially and right now in Canada there's a new lobby for a huge tax credit for the companies on carbon capture and storage, and I really don't think our money should be going towards that. So I believe ISD has direct comparisons between renewable subsidies, which are very low compared to fossil fuel subsidies, but I will put their report in the chat. I think it's the best data that we have out there on fossil fuel subsidies.
Great, thank you. So Vic Buxton, followed by Jean Doherty.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the presentation. By way of background, Tzeporah, I was the chief negotiator for Canada for the Montreal Protocol and one of its major architects, and the reason it was signed in Canada. Now, that's the most successful treaty in history. Every single nation state in the UN stream is a member, it's ratified. You have to ask yourself, why is it? Because in the early stages, we agreed that it was a three-stool approach. And from what I hear with your treaty development, even though I think it's a wonderful initiative, it's only dealing with one leg on the stool. The three legs are the environmental remediation measures, which you put in the focus totally. But there's also the question of the economics and economic impacts and how you deliver with that. And the third leg on the stool is the societal impacts. Because when we were negotiating the Montreal Protocol, we had this group of 77, which was the developing countries way back in 86 and 87. And they said, no, we can't participate in a treaty like this. We don't have access. We don't have the money. The economics was we recognized from the onset that somehow we're going to have to create some funding mechanism to help these companies that can't comply. The initial idea was that we would create a treaty, and the treaty, let's just get the producers to quit producing. And the argument was, well, there's only 30 producers and there's 195 countries. Do you think for one moment other countries aren't going to start producing if they're not signatory to it? So we look at this, and so we ended up creating not just cooperation between all of the parties that were producing the chemicals, in this case it would be fossil fuel, but also, you know, the researchers and some things that were going to help with creating alternatives. And for the economic leg of the stool, we created the Multilateral Fund, which is a multi-billion-dollar assistance program. And for the societal implications, we delayed implementation to developing countries for 10 years to give them a chance to, because they were not the major contributors, give them a chance to catch up and give them access to the fund. So I think all of these things need to be taken into account. And the other aspect is we ruled out the idea of having a treaty that spoke only to producers, because not just for the reason I mentioned, somebody else will start, but it's the point is we needed something that applied to everyone, and you need non-compliance measures built into the treaty. There's got to be ramifications if you choose not to be part of it. So there's lessons to be learned, I think, as you try to develop this treaty for its universal acceptance on a global scale. You know, and so I would suggest that your group take a close look at the outline of the Montreal Protocol and what led to its ultimate success. So your comments on anything I've said, much appreciated.
Oh, Vic, I absolutely agree with you, and I'd love to get some of my political team together and talk to you about your experience with the Montreal Protocol. That would be super helpful. Over the past year, we've done a kind of deep dive in looking at the landmine treaty, nuclear non-proliferation treaty, the TPNW, chemical weapons ban. I don't think the research team has done Montreal Protocol, but looking at both the process to achieve them and the treaties themselves in order to understand lessons learned for the fossil fuel treaty. And we will be releasing some of those papers through our website. If you go under research on our website, you'll see that we have already a number of academic papers and others that we've commissioned around is a fossil fuel exit strategy possible? And how do we address the economic implications? Do we have enough fossil fuels for during the transition? If we look at the needs of each country and the potential uptake in renewables. So that's the fossil fuel exit strategy paper. We took a deep dive last year into the 5 wealthiest countries that are producing the most, and trying to understand those 5 countries, et cetera. So we're definitely in learning mode, and want to learn from the Montreal Protocol. In terms of the economic impacts, it's part of what we're doing in trying to understand the kind of question of how to lump and split the countries and what barriers they would have and what economic impacts stopping expansion would lead to, in order to try and identify then areas of negotiation and necessary funding and funding mechanisms. So obviously the obvious one and low-hanging fruit is around debt forgiveness. But right now we're doing some number crunching, looking at military spending in those top 5 wealthy countries. And what if, what would it look like to say, okay, you have to take 5% of that and put it towards the transition. We're looking at top direct subsidies in a bunch of countries, and whether or not you could create a campaign initiative for those wealthy countries to stop those direct subsidies to the fossil fuel industry, and instead put it into a fund for the transition for the harder countries. So we're not only looking for what needs to be negotiated from an economic perspective under the treaty, but what are different creative ways to spark a conversation on where that funding and money could come from. On societal impacts, we're, on both of these issues, part of why you haven't heard as much about the treaty in Canada, for example, is that in the first year, we focused most of our work in the global south. So we have a very robust Pacific Island strategy program. We have campaign partners in many countries in Africa and in India who are working on the treaty. And we're learning a lot and in Latin America from that work, in order to understand both how to communicate the treaty, but what a treaty needs to look like. Many of the diplomats that we've talked to around the world have said, don't write a treaty, don't draft a treaty, that if you bring in something baked to nation states, that it's less likely that there would be support and engagement for it. But instead, to do the hard work to identify the foundation that you would build off of. So the research, and then the principles of a treaty, and then the mechanisms that could be, and frameworks that could be under a treaty. So that's kind of the stages that we're in now in trying to develop the treaty. And we have a seminar coming up this year at the London School of Economics, which will be bringing together lawyers and diplomats from around the world to start to identify those principles and mechanisms. Yeah, that's just some of a response, but I agree with you, and I'm really looking forward to learning more from the process of the Montreal Protocol.
Yeah, well, one last observation, you should look forward to in opposition from other international agencies. For example, in the case of the Montreal Protocol, it was the World Trade Organization. Mm-hmm. I went with the head of UNEP at the time, Dr. Mustafa Toba, because he was summoned basically by the World Trade Organization saying, you can't introduce these global measures that are going to affect everybody. This is an artificial barrier to trade. And my comment back to him was, no, you're creating an artificial barrier to the preservation of the planet. So I'm saying you have to anticipate where all of these negative voices are likely to come from and how you're going to answer those. Anyway, these are just observations based on experience.
Very, very helpful. And I'm noting Susan's comment in the chat too, how she was working on the civil society NGO end in that experience. Susan, maybe I could convince you to join me and some of our team in a meeting with Vic, so we can learn from your experience. That would be amazing.
Well, if we can facilitate people from our organization from KCOR getting in touch with you, we'll certainly do that. Thanks very much. I noted there's a link there, Vic, between where you can expect to get opposition in my initial question about perhaps getting civil unrest. from people who are in fact opposed to making any kind of reform to our energy system. Thanks very much. We're going to move on to Jean, and I've got Zach Jacobson on deck.
Thank you very much for an absolutely wonderful presentation. And you've, to a degree, answered some of the aspects of my question that I've got. But with respect to comparing this to a nuclear non-proliferation treaty, a nuclear disaster is something that would have absolutely immediate effect, potentially worldwide. And everybody can see that it is a problem. And with respect to climate change, this is like a slow-moving landslide. It has been incredibly difficult for people to really grapple with the fact that climate change is affecting everyone and it is going to have catastrophic effects. So I was just wondering, with respect to Canadians in particular, the last few years have had devastating fires, floods, etc. in Canada, and people are beginning to realize that these are directly affected. These are a direct consequence of climate change. Do you see a lot of pushback? Do you see a lot of people who are beginning to understand that perhaps something like this might be necessary? Or is there anything that has contributed and helped along those lines?
Thanks, Jean. I mean, it's a really astute observation. And I think it is changing very quickly, not only in Canada, but around the world. Because I feel like for the last 10 years in all of my speeches, I was saying, it's slow moving. Many of us don't see the impacts yet in our daily lives, unless you live in the global South, and now that's not true, right? We have fires in California in the middle of winter. We have a fire season that now stretches in many parts of the world all year long. My biggest fear is how quickly we've moved, if you look at the polling and the focus groups, from not acknowledging it's happening and denying it to acknowledging it's happening and experiencing it, to only talking about adaptation or talking about climate change like it's inevitable. And that to me is what's terrifying. A lot of the youth, if you look at the youth polling and you talk to youth, they know it's happening. And they don't think it's possible that we're going to fix it. It breaks my heart to talk to some of my nieces and nephews and close friends' kids who have already decided in their 20s that they'll never have children because they can't bring them into this climate changing world, that they're losing hope. And then, I think we saw yesterday in the BC budget, for example, that governments are flipping really quickly to adaptation because they have to put more money into fighting fires and floods, etc. But at the same time, they're greenlighting new fracking and LNG facilities and money to the oil and gas industry. So I think that's a huge concern, that we leap over the acting on climate change and just start talking about the adapting to a world that is changing. What I think is critical for that argument is actually reminding people that every ton of carbon matters. That at this point in our history, every action that we do to save fossil fuels from burning, from not emitting that ton of carbon, will save lives. So we still do have a chance to mitigate the worst impacts of climate change, to slow it down, maybe even eventually reverse it, because nature is resilient, and we're seeing that. But in order to do that, we have to bend the curve on emissions and production quickly. In terms of the response to the fossil fuel treaty, I have been shocked at how positive it has been. Take a look at some of the motions at city councils around the world, even where there's a strong fossil fuel industry. California, LA, in Vancouver, the unanimous votes in support at councils all around the world for the fossil fuel treaty. And where we are in our campaign plan, when I was designing this campaign plan, I thought that it would take us 2 to 3 years to get the base of support in the concept and then start developing the treaty. We hit all of our milestones in terms of scientific support, civil society group support, cities, etc., in less than a year. It took off, the idea took off like a rocket, basically. And we haven't had significant pushback. And at COP26, this year's the Conference of the Parties on the United Nations Climate Change Conference in Glasgow, this was the first time that we ever had a real conversation about fossil fuels at a COP. And the fossil fuel treaty was the right idea at the right moment. We had over 500 media articles on the fossil fuel treaty, including major outlets, BBC, CNN, you know, long articles on CNN taking the concept seriously and asking countries, you know, what they think of it and how they're responding to it. So, so far the backlash hasn't happened. I expect it's coming. Having been in a lot of these campaigns, my guess is that the fossil fuel industry at this point is trying not to pick a fight with us because they don't want to give our idea air and fuel it with that conflict. But I expect it's coming. However, with the IPCC and the IEA reports last year, the science is on our side. And there are increasingly economic arguments that the economics are on our side. And so really it is about politics at this point. It's about whether or not those governments and individuals who are really under the thumb of the oil and gas industry, you know, can break free and start creating a new conversation. I honestly think if Trudeau had stuck with his version of, we know we're going to need to wind down oil and gas, there are now alternatives, and that's what's going to be healthy and help us fight climate change, which is the kind of thing he was saying when he first got elected, however long that was ago, 8 years ago. He floated that trial balloon, he got attacked, and then he reverted back to, well, no sane government is going to leave it in the ground, and started supporting pipelines as his compromise so that he could get the carbon tax. And in doing that, I think this administration reinforced the oil industries and the far right's frame that fossil fuels and fossil fuel expansion are essential to our economic health. It's not true. Our decision makers have to stop saying it's true. And when they stop saying it's true, then people will understand and believe in the solutions that are viable at scale now and are healthier and provide more jobs. I mean, the fascinating thing about all of this to me, from, you know, campaigning on it for so long, is that the solutions that are being proposed have so many other benefits on health, on clean air, on more jobs, you know, that it is, that it in some ways is shocking that we've made so little success in the last decade. But I do feel like now it's a new conversation over the last year.
Thank you. That really was a very substantive answer, and I appreciate that. Thank you.
Well, I love having so much time. Usually I have, you know, 5 minutes and you have to say only sound bites. And this is a really nice length of time for a webinar. We actually get to have a good discussion. It's great. I'm learning things too.
Well, I hate to tell you, I've got about 10 people lined up here.
Oh, I've got, okay, I'm going to have shorter answers, I promise.
I hope we can move through them quickly. Zach, you're up now, and Peter Bolkowski is next. He's joining us by audio. Zach, unmute, please.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
All right. Third time was the charm. A wonderful talk, and thank you. And that's a wonderful series of ideas, and more power to you. And I'm still laughing at the guy from the, presume it was the guy from the Prime Minister's office who said, "Oh, don't talk about fossil fuels. That's rude." However, I find that what I'm about to say is sometimes thought to be rude. Are you does this presume that nuclear power, not nuclear bombs, nuclear power is going to be a form of clean, supportable energy or not? I would have mentioned something about geoengineering, but I see Paul Beckwith is about to be rude in that direction. So sorry if I'm rude.
No, it's a really important question, and it's a difficult one. And here is where I, some of you who are from Canada and know my work know that I'm not afraid to say the hard stuff and break from the pack. The general answer in the environmental community is no to all nuclear. And I think at this moment in history that is a mistake, that our priority has to be on carbon and keeping carbon from adding up and being trapped in the atmosphere today. That does not mean that I think we should be building new nuclear energy facilities. I think that we need to base the decisions on what energy infrastructure we build in a region on how much is it going to cost, what are the impacts it's going to have, and how quickly can we get it online to replace coal, for example. And
forgive me, but costs and impacts, well, speed online, that's important. Costs and social impacts, I'm sorry, as I'm borrowing this phrase, we're out of perfect solutions.
Oh, I totally agree. There are no perfect solutions. However, when I look at, for example, the work of Dr. Sven Teska, who worked with REN 21 and with me last year on the fossil fuel exit strategy, and his analysis, what it would cost to build a new nuclear facility in almost all the regions where they've been proposed, they're going to be more expensive and they're going to take a hell of a lot longer than renewables at scale. And so I have yet to see a case where, yes, there should be big new nuclear facilities instead of scaling up renewables, electrification, and energy efficiency. However, I don't think that we should be taking existing nuclear facilities offline right now. And I think, we're seeing what's happened when you do that in Germany, where they're now far more dependent on fossil fuels than they were before. And I think that that's a huge mistake.
I'll call that much progress, but generally speaking, our information is that by the time you replace the solar and the wind as often as you have to, you might as well have built the nuclear power. At any rate, what's expensive, building a nuclear power plant or losing your civilization?
And if it was that clear, I would agree with you. I'm not sure it is with the new technologies that are now coming online and the battery and the battery storage and the drop in prices, et cetera, et cetera. So this is, I would defer to folks like Sven Teska or Mark Jacobson and others who study that.
I'm
Okay.
All right, well, apparently we disagree on the 100% Solutions Project and Mark Jacobson's work, but.
Okay, we're going to move on that note. Peter Bolkowski, followed by Art Hunter.
Tzeporah, just so you know my background, I am a chemist, 45 years in oil and gas, most of it oil sands, now semi-retired. So you know the devil you're dealing with. So I'm addressing my question more as a person with Ukrainian ancestry. Basically, the nuclear non-proliferation treaty has failed, more or less completely. We can look at Iran in the process of developing its weapons, North Korea that has developed its weapons and missiles. Ukraine is the only country that had willingly given up nuclear weapons on the basis of the Budapest Memorandum guaranteeing its integrity. It is now being invaded and cut to pieces by Russia, which has also threatened to use nukes if the invasion becomes too difficult. What value could you possibly place in anything signed by Putin, Xi Jinping, Kim, or Ali Khamenei? If you want an international treaty, these are huge players. Russia and China are negotiating or maybe have completed a negotiation for a sale of 100 million tons of thermal coal by Russia to China. Again, if you want an international treaty, the nuke treaty is not a great example because it really has ended up after half a century of not actually accomplishing what we had hoped for it. And we can't trust totalitarian dictators who are in control of much of the consumption and production of fossil fuels.
Thanks, Peter. Those are really important points. First, I want to say, just on your background, that I don't know if you know, but I spent 4 years meeting with senior management of oil companies in the oil sands to try and understand their perspectives on climate change and what needed to be done about it, and chaired the Oil Sands Advisory Working Group for the Alberta government for 2 years, where I reached consensus with oil industry executives and Indigenous nations and scientists on regulations for implementing what was then the Alberta Climate Plan. Unfortunately, all of our recommendations, even though they were consensus-based, Kenny threw out the window along with the Alberta Climate Plan. So in some ways that was a waste of 2 years, but I certainly learned a lot and met a lot of great people who work in the industry. On the issue that you're raising, I think what's really important here to understand is that the journey matters. What we're learning from other treaties is that the journey towards a treaty is absolutely critical in creating new initiatives, bilateral negotiations, and multilateral negotiations, to creating the conversation where ending the expansion of fossil fuels is not only possible, but necessary. And so, you know, I think you're right. I think there are a lot of countries that either won't join or we can't trust what they're saying. But and certainly the NPT was not a resounding success, but in a lot of ways the NPT gave birth to the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the second treaty, and you know, that was in part the coalition of the willing, right, who came together and started to put pressure. I mean, what is the Paris Agreement? It ultimately is just a peer pressure agreement. So what we're trying to do is to create a new conversation to kickstart some of those bilateral and multilateral conversations. I believe we can get to a treaty, but at the same time, the journey towards a treaty is critical. At this moment in our history relative to climate change, I think the most critical issue is leadership. And social change, it's not linear. And when one country steps up and says, yes, we have to do this, and starts to create some conversations or a commission or work with other countries on it, that's going to change the bar. It's also going to change the marketplace. It's also going to change investment. And policy certainty, technological certainty, and then investment certainty are I think the three legs of the stool that are going to shift our energy systems. And so they all interplay with each other. And that's, in part what I mean around when I say social change isn't linear. So part of what we're trying to do with the Fossil Fuel Treaty campaign is kickstart that conversation and kickstart multiple initiatives and dialogues towards constraining the expansion and fast tracking a transition that is based on equity. But certainly it's a cautionary tale. And what we're seeing right now, and we're not spending time right now doing outreach and building support on this work in China or Russia or Saudi Arabia. But that doesn't mean that the impacts of the campaign and the treaty won't be felt in those countries and in the marketplace as a whole. I think they will.
Thank you for your answer.
So there's so many questions there, Dave. I
Yeah.
don't know where you want me to take this.
Okay.
I haven't had
So,
time to read
what
the
it-
chat while we're going, so I'm relying on
No
you.
worries. But we will be publishing the chat on our website. So
Oh,
if
great.
you want to read any of those questions and
I do.
send answers, sure, you could send answers to me and Art, and we will circulate them to everybody who's been interested. So Art's going to get the last question, and then Gina's going to give you a thank you, and you'll be off at your scheduled time.
Okay. There are, of course, a number of people who have said that no matter what you do with regards to fossil fuels, that we're in dire straits because of our population. And there's just far too many of us, and we're consuming all the Earth's resources. And these are far bigger problems than just climate change. So one really has to address all three, the consumption plus population, at the same time as you're addressing fossil fuels. How is your program, your fossil fuel treaty, addressing consumption and population?
Well, first of all, as a campaigner, I would say if you try and address everything at once, you've addressed nothing. If there's one thing that I've learned from 30 years of advocacy campaigns, it's that focus is absolutely critical to making an impact. However, when it comes to the issues of certainly of population, I guess we are addressing it through our analysis of equity and inequality and responsibility. I don't think we're addressing growing population through the treaty initiative at all, but I don't think that's the greatest concern for the world, because I think what we know from the numbers is that a very small percentage of the world's wealthy people consume the far majority of the world's resources and contribute the most to climate change. And I think addressing that inequality that is inherent in our energy and economic systems is absolutely critical to reducing the impact that we have on the earth. And so I guess that's the simple answer, is that I don't think that we can address everything through this one initiative for a fossil fuel treaty. I think the priority right now is building cleaner and safer energy systems, trying to support countries who don't have the capacity to make the right choices, and ensuring that we stop the proliferation of fossil fuels and fossil fuel systems right now. That's what I think is both is a critical economic and ecological priority. And so that's what this initiative is designed to address. And I think in the process of addressing it, we're also going to address a lot of issues around power and equality that underlie the economics of who's having what kind of impact on the earth. But some of the broader issues that you're addressing, we're not. On consumption, for broader issues of sustainability, it's absolutely critical, obviously. And some of you may know that I also run an organization called Stand.earth, where I support the campaigns there. And we've designed a number of campaigns to specifically look at the transport of goods around the world. So Stand.earth is now running a shipping campaign where we're challenging the cargo industry to address its impact, as well as major brands around the world that have the biggest carbon footprint, Walmart, Amazon, etc. And so that campaign is called Ship at Zero. It may be interesting to some of you to take a look at that. And we are also challenging the fashion industry because of its dramatic climate impact. We were shocked when we first started doing this research to find out that the fashion industry, most of the major companies around the world only had scope 1 and scope 2 commitments, not scope 3. So they're looking at what kind of energy they consume in their stores, or maybe in their transportation system, but not at all in the factories that produce the clothing. Scope 3 emissions are about 80% of a company's emissions for an apparel company. And so we now do yearly report cards on the whole industry that rank all of the brands, and are working with some of the brands to dramatically shift their impacts at the source. So I guess rather than working on lifestyle and consumption, I have chosen through Stand and through the Fossil Fuel Treaty to focus on more systemic change and put the onus on government and corporations, because I think that is has the capacity to make greater systemic change, like the pebble in the pond that ripples out for the time frame that we have. And also, I think that the industry has conveniently put the onus on individuals for their lifestyle and their footprint for years and years. And that has taken away from the responsibility of corporations and governments to act, to change our systems so that individuals have different choices that they can make, and it doesn't depend on privilege, being wealthy in order to save up for an electric car, but instead that there are systems in place that give everyone the opportunity to have a low carbon lifestyle. And so that's why I focus on corporate accountability agreements and legislation.
Okay, thank you very much.
I think you just inspired me to go and look up some information on IKEA. I'm going to put up a slide to share now and hand this over to Jean for a quick thank you.
Thank you very much on behalf of KCOR and all of the people here. I would like to thank you very much for an absolutely inspiring talk. And as I am seeing in the chat, such a bold initiative. It really is great to see that this sort of stuff is going on around us, because you can get discouraged, and it's nice to see that someone else is doing this. And so thank you so much for that and for talking about it today. It is an inspiration. So thank you again. And for those people who are here, I would like to say thank you very much for coming to another KCOR presentation. And if you're interested, please go and look at our website, canadiancore.com. There you can find more information about some of the things that are going on in our Stay Informed section. Register for that. You can do that. If you're interested in becoming part of the Canadian Association for the Club of Rome, where you can become involved in some of the dialogues that we have inside, please go again to our website. You can find how to become a member. And in addition to that, this particular presentation and all of the other presentations that we've had can be seen on the YouTube channel, and we encourage you to go there and find it, and you can subscribe to the channel, and so that you will be getting more information from that. So again, on behalf of KCOR, I'd like to thank you very much for an absolutely fabulous presentation.
Thank you so much for having me, everyone. What a great discussion. And I look forward to digging into this chat and meeting some of you one-on-one and learning more.